The ambassador was slaughtered. Humanity returned fire in full force. The room felt wrong the moment we walked in. 6 years of security work had given me a sense for these things. Not instinct exactly, more like a habit of close attention that had quietly rebuilt itself into something faster than thinking. My eyes moved automatically to hands first, then to exits, then to the space between bodies and how much of it there was. Every room had a rhythm to it. People settled. They adjusted their positions. They glanced at notes or at each other or at the ceiling when they were searching for a word. Movement meant thought. Movement meant presence. Movement meant a living being that was engaged with the moment it was in. The Vrethkai delegation was not moving. 11 of them, seated behind a wide table of polished black stone at the center of Velkorath Station's primary diplomatic chamber. Their scales caught the overhead light in deep copper and green, and not one of them had shifted position since the moment we entered the room. No adjustment of posture, no glance between colleagues. No acknowledgement of our arrival, beyond the fact that all 22 of their wide, flat, unblinking eyes had turned toward us at precisely the same moment, as if they had been waiting for a signal that only they could hear. I was the last one through the door, as always. Ambassador Darian Cole was at the front, which was also as always. He had explained his thinking to me once, early in our working relationship, in the patient way he had of explaining things he clearly believed you already understood but wanted to share anyway. An ambassador who walks behind his security team, he said, has already told the room something he cannot take back. He believed the job required complete visibility. He believed that being seen clearly was the only honest way to ask someone to trust you. He was probably right. He was right about most things, which I had found both useful and occasionally maddening over our 4 years together. Darian was 44 years old, which made him one of the younger senior ambassadors in the Unified Earth Foreign Division. He had the kind of face that defaulted to patience rather than neutrality, and there is a meaningful difference between those two expressions. Neutral faces show you nothing. Patient faces show you that something is being held carefully, for the right moment. Darian's face always looked like he was holding something worth the wait. It was part of why people kept talking to him long after they intended to stop. He was carrying the treaty scroll in both hands, held slightly forward, the way you might carry something delicate across a room where the floor was uneven. It was a physical document by design. He had specifically requested it over the standard digital exchange format that most diplomatic transactions use now. He believed that handing someone an object with real weight and texture created a moment of contact that no data transfer could replicate. He said that the instinct to receive something being offered to you was older than language, older than civilization, older than the gap between species. He said it was the kind of thing that worked because it was true before any of the politics were. He had ideas like that constantly. Small, careful, deeply human ideas about how to be present with another person. Our delegation was 7 people, Darian at the front. Behind him, Claire Burton from the Foreign Affairs Division, a sharp and precise woman who chose every word she spoke as if she had already weighed it against all the words she had decided not to use. Beside her, Owen Marsh, our political analyst, who kept a small notebook in the breast pocket of his jacket and had a habit of writing in it during silences that other people found awkward, which he seemed genuinely not to notice. Then Patrick Gale, our cultural liaison and translator, who knew more about the behavioral codes of the Vrethkai than any other human alive, and who had spent the 2 days before this meeting quietly reviewing things he had already reviewed 100 times. Then Lena Ward and Felix Ord, both junior attachés on their first major assignment, both working with the particular visible effort of people trying to look as though no effort was required. And then me, at the rear, watching everyone. The diplomatic chamber itself was built for encounters between species that did not share architecture. The ceiling was high enough to accommodate beings considerably larger than humans, and the lighting was set to a broad-spectrum mid-range that approximated comfort for most known physiologies without fully optimizing for any of them. The table was long enough to ensure physical distance while still allowing the kind of eye contact that suggested sincerity. Someone had thought carefully about all of this. Someone had put real effort into making the room feel like a place where an agreement could happen. The Vrethkai High Emissary was Verk Dahl. He sat at the exact center of his delegation's side of the table, and I understood in some part of my mind that ran faster than words that he was the most dangerous person in the room. Not because of size, though he was tall enough that even seated he dominated the space around him. It was the quality of his stillness. He was watching Darian the way a sensor array watches incoming data. Completely. Without blinking. Without the small social courtesy that most beings, across every species I had encountered, extended to someone who had just entered a room. The courtesy of pretending, just briefly, not to have already decided something. Verk Dahl had already decided something. I took my position at the end of the table, and I kept my breathing steady and I watched. Darian stopped at the midpoint of the table and gave the formal greeting bow that Patrick had coached us on, a short incline from the shoulders with both hands fully visible at the sides. Then he began to speak. I had heard him deliver opening addresses perhaps 30 times. He was a gifted speaker in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He did not fill the room with sound and call it meaning. When he spoke, you believed him, and not because of technique, because there was nothing underneath the words that contradicted them. That kind of honesty is rarer than it should be and more recognizable than most people expect. He spoke about the border zone, about the disputed corridor of space between Vrethkai territory and the outer edge of human colonial expansion. He named the 3 colony worlds that sat within it. He stated the number of people who lived on them. 260,000. He said that number once and let it settle before he continued. The way you let a fact settle when you want the person you are speaking to understand that you are talking about something real. He spoke about what the ongoing dispute had cost both sides over the past 4 years. He spoke about what a formal boundary agreement would open up for both civilizations. He spoke without accusation or grievance, the way someone speaks when they genuinely believe the person across the table is capable of making a good decision. He spoke for about 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, not one member of the Vrethkai delegation changed their expression, shifted in their chair, or gave any indication that they were receiving the words differently than they might receive background noise. I had already noticed, early in the address, that the exits I had mapped when we entered the room were the only exits. The service access on the left wall had a panel lock. The observation gallery above and behind the Vrethkai side of the table was listed as empty in the station manifest, and I had checked that manifest myself 3 hours ago, but I checked the gallery again now with my eyes anyway. It was still empty as far as I could see. When Darian finished speaking, he held the treaty scroll forward with both hands. Such a simple gesture, a rolled document cord-tied extended across a table. He had made that gesture dozens of times in his career, across dozens of tables, across distances of mistrust and history and mutual incomprehension. It was the most basic physical language there was. Here, take this. Let us begin. Verk Dahl looked at the scroll. Then he looked at Darian. His eyes did not move. No one at his side of the table moved. 3 seconds of silence, then 5. I was already shifting my weight forward. The lights went out. Total darkness, no gradients, no gray edges. Complete and immediate, the kind that is not the result of a power failure but of a deliberate cut. I dropped to the floor by reflex and moved sideways away from my last position before I had finished the thought to do it. I heard sounds in that darkness that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, and that I will not describe here in detail. They were brief. They were final. I heard Darian's voice very shortly, and then I did not hear it anymore. Something struck the edge of the table directly above me with a precise, searching force, and was immediately withdrawn. I pressed myself flat and controlled my breathing, and did not move. I lay still for a very long time. When the light returned, the room was completely silent. The Vrethkai delegation was gone. The treaty scroll was on the floor 2 meters from the table. It was still rolled and still tied. It had never been opened. I was the only person on the human side of the room who was still breathing. I looked at the scroll for a moment. I looked at the door. I got up and I walked out. I did not run. Running draws attention, and attention in a hostile environment was the last thing I could afford. I walked with my eyes forward and my pace controlled, the same pace I had always used when moving through unfamiliar spaces with Darian, steady enough to look purposeful and quick enough to cover ground without advertising the fact that I was doing so. The corridors of Velkarath's commercial levels were moving with the ordinary traffic of a crossroads hub. Cargo handlers, station crew, travelers from a dozen species crossing between docking bays and transit lounges, and the rows of small commercial stalls that occupied the station's lower ring. None of them knew what had happened in the diplomatic sector. The stillness of that room had not reached this part of the station yet. I was a woman walking through a busy corridor, and as long as I kept moving, I was just that. My communicator showed a signal but returned nothing when I tried to reach our ship's emergency frequency. I tried twice, using 2 different protocols, and got the same result both times. Someone had blocked communications in and around the diplomatic sector. That took specific equipment, proper positioning, and knowledge of exactly when to activate it. That kind of preparation did not happen in a moment. It happened over days, or weeks, by people who had known in advance exactly what this meeting was going to be. This had never been a negotiation. It had never been intended as one. I passed 2 Vrethkai station staff in one of the mid-level corridors and kept my pace even and my face neutral, and did not look at them more or less than I would look at anyone. They did not look at me. I turned the next corner and let out a breath I had not known I was holding. My shoulder had been bleeding for some time. I became fully aware of this about 3 corridors from the commercial docking level, when the fabric of my jacket pulled against a cut I had not completely registered in the chamber. I kept my arm down and my jacket closed and kept walking. The commercial docking level had 43 active berths. I moved along the row and watched for ships preparing to depart. A freighter near the far end had its loading ramp extended, and its crew moving cargo with the tight, efficient energy of people on a departure deadline. The ship was a mid-range hauler, the kind that ran goods between the outer relay stations and the inner systems. Its registration was Dethrani, which meant it was from a system 3 sectors out, neutral in most political matters because neutrality was consistent with profit. I walked up the ramp without invitation. The crew member at the top was a broad Dethrani male with gray-blue skin and the 6 arms that were characteristic of his species, currently occupied with a cargo manifest and a portable scanner. He looked at me with the expression of someone doing rapid calculations. I was clearly not in good condition. My jacket was closed, but my face probably showed things I had not yet found a way to hide. I told him I needed passage off the station. I told him I had security field experience and was willing to work for the fare. I told him I could handle myself on a long transit. He looked at me for a moment and then called for his captain. The captain's name was Boren. He came down the interior ramp with the unhurried walk of someone who had spent a long time at this job and had learned that urgency was usually someone else's problem. He was older than his crew member, with a network of old scars across the left side of his face that told a story he had apparently decided not to tell in any other way. He looked at me directly, which I respected. I told him the same things I had told his crew member: passage off the station in exchange for whatever work he needed done. He asked what had happened to my shoulder. I told him there had been a serious problem in the diplomatic sector. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that a station-wide notice had just come through asking all vessels to delay departure, pending a security review of the diplomatic sector. I asked how long he intended to wait on that request. He studied my face for 3 seconds. I did not look away. Then he told his crew member to bring in the ramp. He took me to the ship's small medical bay himself and treated the cut on my shoulder without unnecessary commentary, and he gave me a place to sit in the forward lounge and brought me something warm to drink that I did not recognize but accepted. We left the station 19 minutes later. Boren did not ask me many questions in the first hours. He had the quality of someone who had seen enough of the wider galaxy to understand that some situations needed time before they could be spoken about. He checked on me twice and both times left without pressing, which was the right thing to do. About 3 hours into the transit, the ship's communication system received a public broadcast on the Galactic Open Channel. Boren called for me from the bridge. The broadcast was from the Vrethkai Dominion's official communication office. It was addressed to the Galactic Conclave as a whole and transmitted on every active open frequency, which meant it was intended for every civilized species simultaneously. The language was formal and structured in the way of a legal declaration. The human diplomatic delegation to Velkarath Station had arrived in an unauthorized capacity. The Vrethkai Dominion was asserting complete sovereignty over the contested border zone and all colonial settlements within it. The human presence in the region was an incursion. The delegation had been, in the official Vrethkai phrasing, dismissed without standing. Below the formal language, in the cultural subtext Patrick Gale had spent years teaching me to read, the message carried something harder. The Vrethkai had used a specific ceremonial term that did not translate cleanly into standard galactic common. Patrick had explained it to me a long time ago. It described the removal of something that had wandered into a space it did not belong in. Not an enemy being driven back. Not a rival being defeated. Something smaller than that. Something that had been in the way. I stood in the communication room and listened to the full broadcast twice. Boren was at the door when I turned around. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had settled on what he wanted to say and was making a final decision about whether to say it. He told me he was deeply sorry for what had happened. He said it sincerely, and I believed him. Then he said that in his experience, the most difficult thing about being a young civilization in a very old galaxy was learning which situations could be resolved and which could only be absorbed. He said the Vrethkai were a very old and deeply established power. He said that sometimes the wisest response a young species could give to a situation like this was to step back, protect what it had, and find another way forward in time. He said it with 6 arms folded across a broad chest and genuine kindness in his eyes. He meant every word of it. He was trying to help. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "We do not go home, we go back." He opened his mouth and then did not say anything. I think something in my voice told him that I did not mean we were going back to the table. I returned to the forward lounge and sat down with the sounds of the ship around me and the image of that treaty scroll lying on the floor, still tied, never opened. I thought about Darien and the way he had walked into that room ahead of me, shoulders level, scroll in both hands, believing completely that the right words spoken honestly to the right people could build something that would outlast all of them. I did not feel what I had always imagined grief would feel like. I had expected something that moved fast and hit hard. What I felt instead was quiet and dense and permanent, something settling into the center of me like weight that would not shift. Like something had been placed inside a room that would never be empty again. By the time we reached the nearest human transit relay station, the galactic commentary networks were already running the story. Every major service in the civilized sectors had the broadcast. Analysis and reaction were coming in from species across 12 systems. The consensus, reading through it on a borrowed terminal in the relay station's waiting area, was that humanity would file a formal protest, that there might be trade pressure, that there would be an extended period of tense diplomatic back and forth while the border situation continued. That was the expected script. That was what civilized species did. I read through the commentary and thought about what I knew about the people who were sitting in rooms on Earth right now, reading the same material I was reading and arriving at very different conclusions. Then I boarded the first available transport heading home. Earth was quiet when I landed, not the quiet of people who did not know. Everyone knew. It had been 7 days and the story had been everywhere, on every channel, in every language. The quiet was something else. It was the particular quality of silence that exists in a room where a decision is being made, the kind of decision that does not announce itself because it does not need to. The first debriefing was with the Foreign Affairs Division Security Review Board. 4 people across a plain table, recorders running, asking me to go through the sequence of events in the diplomatic chamber in as much detail as I could provide. I went through it twice without notes. The second time, one of the reviewers asked me to slow down at certain points, and I did, giving them the small specifics they were after. The duration of the communications blackout, the exact moment of the lighting failure, the number and position of the Vrethkai when we entered the room. The second debriefing was with the Intelligence Division's Field Analysis Team. Different room, different faces, same events with different emphases. They were less interested in the sequence and more interested in the preparation. How far in advance the communications block would have required positioning. What the station's staff rotation would have looked like in the days before our arrival. Whether anything in the Vrethkai delegation's behavior during the preliminary session 2 days before had indicated what was coming. I told them what Patrick Gale had once told me about pre-engagement behavior in Vrethkai military doctrine, the absolute cessation of movement. The way a delegation primed for action stopped mirroring the social behavior of the beings around them because they had moved past the social frame entirely. I told them I had noticed it within the first minute and that it had felt wrong and that I had made the decision to believe I was reading it incorrectly, because the documented range of Vrethkai diplomatic stillness included it barely at the outer edge. One of the analysts asked me why I had not stopped the delegation from entering. I looked at that analyst for a long moment. Then I said, because I thought I was being too cautious. Because Darian Cole had looked at me over breakfast that morning and told me that this treaty was the most important thing he had ever carried, because he needed me to trust that it would be received. The analyst did not ask another question after that. The third debriefing was before the United Earth Security Council. 31 people in a large formal chamber in New Geneva, every seat filled. The room so still when I walked in that my footsteps sounded much too loud on the polished floor. I stood at the center and told them everything from memory, not from the reports I had filed, not from notes. Memory was where the truth of it actually lived, and I owed them the truth. I told them about the room and the table. I told them about Darian's voice during the address and the quality of silence from the Vrethkai side. I told them about the scroll in his hands and the gesture of offering, and the 3 seconds of stillness before the lights went out. I told them what I heard in the dark. I told them how long I lay still and why, and what I found when the lights returned. Then I told them about the broadcast, about the official language and what lay underneath it, about Boren's genuine kindness and the word he had recommended, retreat. I finished, and the chamber was silent enough that the ventilation system sounded intrusive. Council Director Cora Steele sat at the center of the council table. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that moved quickly and held what they found. She let the silence sit for a moment, then asked me one question. She asked, in your professional assessment, was there any action you could have taken that would have changed the outcome of that meeting? I thought about it honestly. I gave it the time it deserved. Then I said no. She nodded once. The session continued without me. I was escorted to a waiting room. I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours. During those 4 hours, A Vrethkai senator named Oreth delivered a public address to the Dominion's parliament. The address was picked up on open galactic media and distributed within the hour. He spoke at length about humanity's silence in the days since the diplomatic incident. He described that silence as the appropriate response of a species that had come to understand the limits of its position in the galaxy. He said he expected Earth to make a formal statement within the week, acknowledging the new boundary and beginning the process of withdrawing from the contested colonial worlds. He said it with the particular ease of someone who has never been wrong before and cannot locate any reason to start questioning that record. What Oreth did not know, and what I was beginning to understand in fragments over the days that followed, was that humanity's silence had nothing at all to do with acceptance. On day 12, I was given access to a partial restricted briefing. Admiral Grace Turner, commanding officer of the Unified Earth Fleet, had been in continuous strategic planning sessions since the night of the incident. Her team was mapping the Vrethkai Dominion's military structure in precise detail. Assets, response times, communication routes, supply chains, fleet positioning, repair yard capacity. The map was extraordinarily detailed and it was still growing. Earth had been watching the Vrethkai for 4 years, not because of any specific anticipated conflict, but because watching neighboring civilizations was standard strategic practice. Quiet, patient observation that accumulated the way compound interest accumulates, quietly, until one day you have considerably more than you realized. On day 18, I was given full clearance. The full briefing was delivered by Admiral Turner herself. She was tall and straight-backed in the way of someone for whom good posture had long since stopped being an effort. She walked into the room, set nothing on the table, and began speaking from memory, which told me something about how thoroughly she had been living inside this plan. It was not a punitive strike. It was not a show of force or a calibrated pressure action designed to invite renewed negotiation. It was something that had a different shape entirely. The kind of shape that forms when a civilization decides, quietly and completely, that it is finished explaining itself. 17 simultaneous vectors of engagement. Every significant Vrethkai military installation, communication relay, weapons depot, and fleet support facility reached within the same 6-hour window, not sequentially, simultaneously. By assets that had been moving into position for weeks, traveling in complete signal silence, arriving at 17 different points across Vrethkai space at a coordinated time that the Dominion had no way to anticipate because they had no way to detect the preparation. The human fleet, as it would turn out, was considerably larger than Vrethkai intelligence had estimated. Humanity built ships quickly and continuously, and did not always make public what it built. The Dominion's estimate of our fleet strength sat at roughly 40% of the actual figure. General Conrad Pierce briefed on ground deployment doctrine. He was compact and direct, and moved through a briefing without a wasted word. He spoke about what made human soldiers difficult to account for in an enemy's planning models. Not raw strength, not speed. Endurance. The capacity to absorb difficulty and remain functional. The distinction between a being that is trying to survive a situation and a being that is trying to finish one. Most civilizations, he said, trained their forces around the first model. It was rational. It was adaptive. It worked in almost every scenario they had ever encountered. It did not fully account for humans. On day 37, I was in the briefing room when Admiral Turner authorized Earth's formal public response to the Vrethkai Declaration. I had expected a statement of intent. A careful, measured declaration of the kind that left room for interpretation and maintained diplomatic deniability while signaling seriousness. Earth broadcast 3 words, translated into every active galactic language, transmitted simultaneously on every open frequency. We remember everything. I heard it come through the speakers and felt, for the first time since Velkorath, something shift inside me. Not peace, not satisfaction, something simpler and more functional, the feeling of a direction being set, of a door closing on one thing and a path becoming clear toward another. On day 30th, the fleet moved. I was on the bridge of the flagship when the engagement began, and the bridge was quiet in the way that spaces are quiet when everyone in them is completely focused. The ship's name was painted on its hull in letters large enough to read from a considerable distance. It had been the UES Harlow until 6 days before departure, when Admiral Turner submitted a renaming request to the Fleet Registry. The request was approved the same day, and the new name was applied within hours. Nobody argued about it. Nobody needed to explain it. The name was Darian Cole. Captain Ian Dryden commanded the ship. He was lean and about 50, with a calm that came not from distance but from depth, the kind of steadiness that had been tested and had held. He had given me a workstation on the port side of the bridge on the first day and had not hovered over me since, which was exactly the right instinct. I had asked to be part of the fleet 6 weeks before departure, still sitting in New Geneva waiting for the Council's decision on my status. The answer had come back as yes, with the condition of an advisory role on the flagship rather than a frontline deployment. I accepted without pushing back, which surprised the officer who delivered the news. He said he had expected more resistance. I told him the bridge was exactly where I needed to be. The engagement began at 400 hours. The Vrethkai operational cycle meant their readiness was at its lowest in the interval corresponding to deep night. A pattern 4 years of observation had documented precisely enough to build into the timeline. The first contact reports began arriving within minutes of the opening action. The Vrethkai Home Fleet's primary communication hub lost signal at 4:07 hours. The northern repair yards were taken offline at 4:09. The deep space relay chain connecting the Dominion's outer military installations to its central command was severed not at one point but at 11 simultaneously, at 4:11, leaving the outer stations unable to reach headquarters or communicate with each other. The Dominion had woken up that morning to find itself in pieces, each piece unable to speak to the others. On the ground engagement fronts, the situation was slower and less predictable. Ground combat always was. The Vrethkai ground forces were experienced, well-equipped, and operating on territory they knew well. They were not easily moved. But the reports coming back from human ground units had a quality that I noticed after the first hour and could not set aside. The Vrethkai had established defensive positions and were holding them effectively, inflicting genuine cost on the advancing human units. In most engagement models that would slow an advance considerably. What the reports described instead was human units absorbing those costs and continuing to move forward, not recklessly, not without tactical adjustment, but forward, maintaining pressure, behaving as though the loss of a portion of their number was a logistical problem requiring a solution rather than a signal requiring a pause. The Vrethkai ground commanders had no contingency for this because their doctrine had not included it. Their training was built around the principle that every species, when absorbing sufficient loss, recalculated, pulled back, chose preservation over objective. It was a rational model. It was correct for almost every species they had ever engaged with. It was not fully correct for humans. Patrick Gale had said something to me once, in a transit lounge years before any of this, while reading a paper on conflict patterns across the civilized species. He looked up from it and said that the oldest surviving civilizations in the galaxy had mostly made it to old age by being very good at recognizing when to stop, at accurately calculating when a cost exceeded a gain, and acting on that calculation without sentiment. He paused and then said that humanity was interesting, because it had survived by doing something slightly different, not by knowing when to stop, but by knowing how to continue even when stopping was the only option the situation seemed to be offering. He said it as an observation. He was not praising it or warning against it. He was just nodding it the way you note a fact that is real regardless of how you feel about it. I thought about that on the bridge, while the tactical display tracked 17 simultaneous engagement zones, and the numbers moved. At 600 hours, a communication request came in from the Vrethkai command frequency. Admiral Turner was on the bridge by then, standing near the main display without sitting, watching it with her arms at her sides. The communication officer flagged the incoming request and looked at her. Turner was still for a moment, then she asked which frequency. The officer told her. It was the standard military command channel used for direct communication between fleet commanders. The correct channel for anyone who wanted to negotiate or discuss terms. Turner looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Tell them their request has been received. Do not open the channel." The officer sent the acknowledgement. The channel stayed closed. By 900 hours, the Vrethkai fleet formations across the 3 primary defense sectors had begun to fragment. Not a coordinated retreat. Fragmentation. Units losing coordination with each other. Some trying to establish new defensive lines. Others falling back toward remaining communication infrastructure, trying to re-establish contact with a command center that could not hear them. It was, according to every fleet analyst on the bridge, something that had not been observed in any Vrethkai military engagement in 800 years of recorded history. Their formations had never behaved like this. Their soldiers were not failing from lack of courage. They were failing from lack of reference. There was no doctrine page for this scenario because no one had ever needed to write one. Captain Dryden came and stood near my workstation at some point in the late morning. He looked at the display for a while and then at me. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was. He held the look for a moment with the manner of someone accepting an answer without fully endorsing it. Then he said that he had read the briefing file on Ambassador Cole. He said he seemed like someone worth knowing. I said that he was, exactly that. Dryden nodded once and went back to his station. At 1340 hours, the last active Vrethkai fleet signal in the engagement zones went silent. The remaining units had withdrawn behind the boundary of their home system and gone completely dark. The outer installations had been secured or had stood down once the impossibility of coordinated resistance became clear. The sharp edge of it was over. I stood at my workstation and looked at the tactical display. The 17 vectors were gone. The map showed positions and secured zones and the quiet geometric result of what 38 days of silence had built toward. I thought about what Darien had said to me once, returning from a successful trade negotiation on a minor dispute. He was in a good mood, the specific good mood of someone who had done something they believed in. He had found a bottle he kept for occasions worth marking, poured 2 glasses, handed me one, and said that the hardest thing about this work was that success looked identical to nothing happening. A good diplomatic outcome was just the world continuing, the way it would have continued anyway, but better. You had to care about the invisible version of things. You had to believe that the future you had prevented from going wrong was worth everything you had spent to prevent it. He raised his glass and said, "To the things that do not happen because we were in the room." I stood on a ship named after him and looked at a display showing what we had done. We had not prevented something this time, but we had finished something. And I knew, the way I knew very few things that clearly, that he would have understood the difference between those 2 outcomes and would not have turned away from either one. I put down the stylus I had been holding without knowing I was holding it. I sat down. I let the room be what it was. 1 year is almost nothing in galactic time. The conclave had been in continuous session for over 800 years before humanity joined it. Its oldest members had been traveling between stars for 3,000 years before humans had mastered written language. A single year, by their measure, was barely the space between one thought and the next. And yet in the 12 months following the engagement, the conclave changed in ways that most of its members had not seen across the previous century. The shape of the room shifted. The way delegations spoke to each other shifted. The assumptions that everyone had been comfortable carrying into every meeting shifted, quietly at first and then not so quietly, until the shift was simply the new condition of things. I watched most of it from the inside. I had not planned to become an ambassador. My career had been built around protection, standing between someone I was responsible for and whatever might come for them. The fact that I had failed at that in the one moment that mattered most was not something I had found a clean way to settle. I thought about it every day. I expected I always would. But 6 months after the engagement, Director Steele had called me to her office and placed a file on the desk between us. Inside the file was an appointment letter from the Earth Security Council, a formal nomination for the position of Unified Earth Ambassador to the Galactic Conclave. I read it twice. Steele said nothing while I read. She was very good at silence. She had the patience of someone who had spent a long career understanding that silence was usually a better tool than most of the other ones available. I asked her why me. She said, because you were there. Because every species in that conclave chamber has read what happened at Velkorath and has read what followed, and when they see you walk through that door, they will not need a briefing document to understand that Earth did not send someone who knows about things from a comfortable distance. I asked her whether she believed I would be effective. She said, I believe you will be honest, and I have found that honesty, applied consistently and without apology, tends to outlast most other approaches. I accepted the appointment. The 6 months between acceptance and my first formal appearance before the conclave were full. The Vrethkai Dominion had requested a formal ceasefire arrangement within a week of the engagement's conclusion, and the negotiations around that arrangement had been long and, at points, strange. The Dominion entered those negotiations expecting the kind of terms that a dominant power extracted from a weaker one: territory, resource rights, political concessions, tribute in various forms. They had prepared extensive counterpositions for all of those possibilities. Earth's actual terms had confused them considerably. Earth did not want Vrethkai territory. Earth had no interest in resource extraction from Dominion systems or political authority over Dominion governance. Earth wanted 3 things. The first was formal recognition of the 3 contested colonial worlds as human territory, with a fully acknowledged and legally binding boundary. The second was a complete international tribunal process, conducted under Galactic Conclave jurisdiction, for the events at Velkorath. All evidence submitted to an independent panel, full proceedings on the open record. The third was an acknowledgement, a formal statement entered into the permanent record of the Galactic Conclave, that the human delegation had arrived in good faith, had not been received in good faith, and that what had been done to them was deliberate, unprovoked, and in violation of every foundational principle of galactic diplomatic practice. Not an apology, not softened language negotiated down from something harder, a plain statement of fact, worded plainly in the record permanently. The Vrethkai negotiators rejected the third condition immediately and spent the following weeks working through creative variations of the first 2. They offered reduced military deployment zones. They offered significant material reparation. They offered to cede a handful of minor territorial claims in peripheral systems. All of those were costs with futures attached, costs that could be offset eventually by different conditions. They understood those costs. What they could not absorb easily was being required to state, in a document that every civilization in the conclave would read, and that would exist in the official record permanently, that they had done what they had done. Earth held the third condition for 11 weeks without movement. In the 12th week, the Vrethkai delegation signed all 3. I read the signed agreement on a screen in my office and felt something loosen slightly in my chest, very slightly, Not enough to be called relief or resolution, but something real. The conclave session in which I formally appeared as Earth's ambassador was held in Velkorath Station's main chamber. The station had been completely rebuilt in the months following the engagement. The diplomatic sector had been refitted entirely. The chamber where the human delegation had met was gone. The new chamber was larger, built to a different plan, with better lighting systems and fully independent communication panels for every delegation. The station's engineering team had made every improvement that the old design had failed to provide. I noticed all of those changes when I walked through the diplomatic wing. I also noticed the plaque. It was small, set into the wall just inside the main entrance to the diplomatic wing, at shoulder height, easy to miss if you were not looking. The station staff had installed it sometime during the reconstruction, without being asked, without announcement. A small rectangle of dark metal with clean, clear lettering. It gave Darian Cole's name and his title. Below that, the names of Claire Burton, Owen Marsh, Patrick Gale, Lena Ward, and Felix Ord. Below those names, one line. They came with open hands. I stood in front of it for a moment. The corridor was quiet. Most delegations had already gone inside. I placed my hand flat against the plaque. The metal was cool. I thought about open hands, about what it cost to extend one toward uncertainty, and what it meant when that cost was met with something worthy of it, and what it meant when it was not. Then I went in. 42 delegations were present, every recognized member of the Galactic Conclave, plus 3 observer species currently in the candidacy process. The chamber was large enough to hold them all with generous space between each group, the architecture built to prevent anyone from feeling pressured by proximity. It was a good room. Someone had thought carefully about it. The senior administrator, a Thelian named Voss, had held his position for 60 years and announced delegations with the steady composure of someone who had announced a great many things and allowed none of them to alter his pace. He spoke my name and title into the chamber's amplification system, Earth's formal designation following, and stepped back. I walked to the center position. I had written a speech, multiple drafts of it across 3 weeks, working through what I wanted to say and how, revising and refining until I had something I could read 6 times and stand behind completely. I did not use it. Somewhere on the walk from the plaque to the podium, I had decided that the written version was the right speech for someone who needed to manage the impression they made, someone unsure of their footing, someone who needed the safety of prepared words between themselves and the room. I was many things in that moment. Unsure of my footing was not one of them. I looked out at 42 delegations. Every one of them was watching me with the specific quality of attention that beings give to something they are genuinely trying to understand. Not hostile, not even skeptical, exactly. The attention of a large group of people who had seen something they had not expected and were still in the process of deciding what it meant about them and about us, and about everything that came next. I said, "I know what you think of us." The chamber was very quiet. I said, "I know that when humanity arrived in this conclave 11 years ago, we were the newest species at this table, the youngest, the least traveled, the least tested by any standard the galaxy had developed over its long history. I know that most of you made certain assessments about what that meant for what we were capable of, what we understood, and what we could be trusted with. Some of those assessments were fair, some of them were not. I am not here to argue which ones fall into which category, because that argument has been answered by events in a way that does not require me to add words to it." I paused and let the silence hold. I said, "What I am here to tell you is something that I believe most of you already understand, but that needs to be said plainly in this room, and entered into the record of this conclave with the same clarity as the agreement we signed last month." I said, "Humanity did not want this. We did not arrive in the galaxy looking for this. Darian Cole was not a soldier. He was a man who believed that the distance between any two civilizations could always be crossed if both sides were willing to take one step toward the middle. He carried that belief into every room he ever entered. He carried it right up to the last moment of his life, and so did every person who walked into that chamber with him. A Vrethkai observer was seated at the far end of the chamber, not Verk Dahl, who was currently before an international tribunal and would remain there for some time. This was a younger representative assigned to observe the session as part of the Dominion's post-agreement obligations. He was watching me with an expression I could not read. I met his gaze for a moment before continuing. I said, "I have spent the last year being asked in many ways and by many people whether humanity regrets what it did. Whether, with the distance of a year, we would have chosen differently. Whether the scale of the response was proportionate to what had been done." I said, "That question misunderstands what happened. Our response was not a calculation made by planners looking at a chart. It was the expression of something that was already true about us before any of this occurred, something that I believe this conclave needs to understand clearly if we are going to work together for the centuries ahead." I said, "We will always come to the table first. Every time, without exception, we will arrive with proposals in good faith and the genuine conviction that the problems between us are capable of being solved through honest conversation. We will send our best people. We will send people who believe completely in what they are doing. We will try, every single time, because that is what we are, and it is not going to change regardless of what it costs us." I stopped. I let the room breathe. I said, "But if you take those people from us, then what follows will not be a protest or a calibrated pressure campaign or a period of tense back and forth while we reconsider our position. What follows will be everything we have, directed with absolute precision, applied without pause, until the matter is fully and finally resolved. That is not a decision we make in anger, though there is anger. It is not a decision we make in grief, though there is grief. It is simply what we do. We do not leave things unfinished. We have never left things unfinished. That is as true about us as anything else is." I said, "Earth intends to be a committed and constructive presence in this conclave. We want to contribute. We want to be part of the work that makes this gathering worth having. We want to build things here that last. We want to be the kind of partner that every member of this body can rely on, and we will be that partner, fully and without reservation." I said, "But we are asking you to understand what you are working with. We are a civilization that will open our hands every single time until the last time. And when that last time comes, we will respond in the way you have now seen. Not to punish, not to demonstrate power, because we remember and we finish what has been started and we do not stop." I said, "Ambassador Cole believed in this room. He spent his career building toward exactly this kind of space. I'm standing here in his place, and I intend to honor that work every single day that I hold this position. I am asking each of you to honor it with me, not out of concern for what humanity will do, out of belief that this work is worth doing, out of the same conviction that brought him across the galaxy to extend a document to someone who had already decided not to receive it. I said Earth is taking that step, in this room right now." I finished speaking. For a moment nothing happened at all. The room was completely still. Then the Thelian administrator, Voss, rose from his seat. He did not applaud. He extended both hands forward, palms open and facing upward. It was the oldest acknowledgement gesture in the galactic diplomatic tradition, one of the few gestures shared in essentially the same form by nearly every spacefaring species that had ever found it necessary to communicate across the distance between them. It meant, "We have heard you. We understand what has been said. We will not put it down." One by one, around the chamber, every delegation rose and held the same gesture. Not all immediately. Some took longer than others. A few seemed to be having a quiet internal conversation about it that resolved after a moment. But by the time the last delegation had risen, every group in that chamber was on its feet, 42 groups of beings from across the known galaxy, hands open, in complete silence. I stood at the center of it. I thought about Darian holding that treaty scroll forward with both hands, the simplest possible gesture, the most human thing he had ever done in a room full of people who were not human. I thought about how that gesture had been refused, how everything he was and believed had been refused in the dark of a neutral station while I lay 2 meters away and could not stop it. And I thought about the fact that every pair of hands now open in this chamber, hands that had claws or extra joints or scales or 3 fingers or 6, were open in the same direction his had been. He had wanted this. He had worked his whole life toward exactly this kind of room, this kind of moment, this kind of answer. He had not lived to stand in it. But it was here. It was real. It existed in this room in this moment, and it was the consequence, in the most direct and traceable sense, of who he had been and what he had chosen to believe every single day of his working life. I let myself feel that, all of it at once. The loss and the weight and the permanent absence of him, and the strange, clear thing underneath all of those that I did not have a precise word for but that I recognized as true. Something that was neither peace nor victory nor grief, but that contained all 3 and resolved into something quieter and steadier than any of them alone. I walked out of the center of the room. I walked back through the main door of the diplomatic wing. The corridor was still empty. I stopped in front of the plaque. I looked at the names, all of them, one by one. I thought about what Patrick had known about the Vrethkai and what it had cost him. I thought about Claire's careful words in Owen's small notebook. I thought about Lena and Felix, who had been on their first major assignment and had made it into that room and had conducted themselves with complete professionalism right up until there was nothing left for professionalism to be applied to. I thought about the open hands. I put my palm flat against the plaque one more time. The metal was cool and smooth and solid. He had wanted peace badly enough to die for it. I had wanted justice badly enough to carry it across a year of grief and planning, and a war that I had advised on and watched unfold from a bridge with his name on it. Maybe, somewhere in the space between those 2 things, between what he had believed and what I had done, that was where the galaxy finally learned to be careful with what it was offered. I took my hand away. I turned and walked toward the exit, out into the long corridor that led back to the rest of the station and the rest of the work, and all the meetings and negotiations and difficult conversations still ahead. The long, ordinary work of 2 civilizations trying to figure out how to share the same piece of the universe without destroying what both of them were trying to build. The stars outside the station windows were the same stars they had always been, cold and steady, and completely indifferent to what any of us made of the time we had out here among them. We were not done. We would never be fully done. But we were here, we remembered, and we were not going anywhere.